her own personal.
Okay, I'm gonna let everyone in. Okay, we're just gonna give it another minute or two.
Welcome, everyone.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Timely Topics. My name is Michaela Hartle. I'm a program assistant at CCEI. Today, we are joined by our very own Rory McGloin, a professor and communication consultant. Today, Rory will be discussing the importance of storytelling in your business pitch. Rory, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Michaela. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is a timely topic for sure. Communication has never gone out of fashion. In today's conversation, which is all about storytelling, we would be remiss to not talk a little bit about where stories came from and ultimately where they're going. So before we dive right in and I give you some of the best practices that you're going to be able to put into play later on today in your interpersonal and day-to-day business communications, I do want to take a moment and just talk a little bit about story itself for a second, because the way in which we think about story, deliver story, read story, hear story has changed dramatically. My parents came from Ireland, one of them literally on a boat. And when they came over, I grew up in a culture that was storytelling heavy. And chances are that's probably why I ended up in this area. But for me, the stories were told in places that are in some ways long forgotten, right? They were often told by the elder members of the community, snuggled up around a big turf fire. Sometimes there were a few pints of Guinness on the table. And the more dramatic the story got, the hushes and the whispers would come quite low. And to me, some of the storytellers that I looked up to, they were so inspiring because they could hold the attention of an entire room in such eloquent ways. And they did it because they looked and they sounded and they acted like they were actually reliving the story that they were a part of. But guess what? For many of you that are listening today, and for many of you that may go and watch this, you might not be able to relate to that type of storytelling. You look at it and you think, yeah, that's storytelling. But I want to challenge you, because we're finding new ways to tell stories. So no matter who you are, where you come from, or what storytellers you look up to, you are a storyteller. And when I look at the process of communication, the very first thing that I want to do today is I want to remind you that stories can be told through a wide range of channels. And it's very important that you, a storyteller, begin to determine and assess what channels are best for me to tell our stories. Because today's youngsters and those of us who have young people in our life, we know that they're not telling their stories snuggled around turf fireplaces. They're doing it on Instagram. They're doing it on TikTok. Some of you are telling your stories on Reddit. Some of you are telling your stories on your various boards and even on your personal profiles and screens. So what I want to remind you is that everything that we're going to talk about today from a storytelling perspective, it doesn't have to be done in shared spaces. It doesn't have to be done in front of audiences or microphones or big rooms. Find the channel to tell your story and use the principles of what we're talking about, whatever it is that you're trying to convey. The next thing that I want to draw your attention to in this process of communication are the two Lego characters that we see fixated on either end of the slide. Now, for the vast majority of my career, when I've been asked to come in and do workshops, everybody fixate on the left-hand side because that's you. You're here to get better at storytelling, right? So you assume that in order to get better at storytelling, that you've got to do a lot of work to figure out how you're going to ultimately be the best storyteller in your business pitch and through all of your day-to-day activities. But I'm going to stop you right there. And if you want to be a great storyteller, I'm going to invite you to take a look at the far right side of that slide and to look at the other blue Lego character on there. And I want to invite you to always start with your audience. By starting with your audience, you can work backwards. You can determine what abilities or skills they have to be able to even decode your message. Do they speak the same language? Do they share the same culture? What is it that they want, that they need? Next, what channel are you likely to find the people in your audience most likely to pay attention to? Is it Instagram? Is it Facebook? Is it face-to-face? Those decisions are critical before you even go to encode your message, because the channel is going to dictate what you can or cannot do. If you're a great photographer and you love going around the state and taking pictures of food and sharing your stories, and Instagram is a great channel to do that. Maybe you're a great writer. Maybe you do love getting in front of audiences and microphones and making people laugh. So I need you to think about channel before you think about the message. And then, of course, what we're going to get to today is how do you select, organize, and then ultimately deliver a great story to get people to do things. So let's talk about doing things for a second, right? So we're going to agree for at least the next 25 minutes or so that communication is a never-ending cyclical process. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the slide here, right, we have a source, it's sending a message through a channel to a receiver, but instantaneously in that exact moment, the receiver is sending information back to the source, and that never ends. In communication, we say you cannot not communicate. So if you agree with me, or at least if you'll suspend your other beliefs for at least the next 24 minutes, and you believe that communication is a never-ending cyclical process, then I challenge you, what makes your business plan, your pitch, different? And chances are you're probably answering somewhere in your head, or maybe even in our chat, and saying, well, my business plan and my pitch has a goal. It has an outcome. I want something out of it. And to me, I would describe the vast majority of business plans and pitches that we sit here and we listen to at CCEI and throughout very many of our other works, they are persuasive by nature. And I'm starting here because I want you to recognize that your story in the business and entrepreneurial space must be somewhat persuasive. And in order to be persuasive, we need three things. Persuasion implies something more specific than communication. For me to say that I communicated with my audience does not infer very much other than I sent a message. For me to say that I persuaded my audience to invest, to come on board, to become my partner, to work with me, to support me, to mentor me, it implies something much different. So the three things that we need to be able to use and imply and infer persuasion are what? First and foremost, we need a goal. We have to have something that we want. Secondly, we have to be able to measure that outcome. How do we know if we've been successful if we can't measure the metric? And then finally, to be able to use that word persuasive, to be able to say that you were persuasive in front of your audience, you have to be successful. And so today is ultimately about helping to make more of your stories and to make more of your business plans and your pitches more successful. And we need to acknowledge that although we're talking about story today, we're ultimately talking about persuasion and influence. And how do we get people's attention? How do we maintain their attention and ultimately get them to do the thing that we want them to do? Now, I know you all showed up likely to take a few tidbits away from you with how to tell a better story. And we're going to get to that. But I have a personal philosophy to never tell somebody what to do before I talk to them a little bit about why we're doing that. So let's check this out for a second. When we think about the outcomes of successful communication, and I've got a little bit of a word cloud here, and I've been collecting these answers for quite some time, but I'd love for you to chime in the chat today. There's 17 of us on here. So tell me in your own words, using your vernacular, what is it that happens? What do you feel? What do you obtain when you engage in successful communication? When you are persuasive? What does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that feel like to you? And I ask you this because I think far too often the entrepreneurs that we work with, particularly in their very early stages, they come in with one single metric, right? They're looking oftentimes for an investor. They're looking for dollars. And yes, you see money listed on my word cloud, but look what else is there too, right? When we have successful communication, we build relationships, we save time, we make better decisions, we become more aware. We're impressed, we're awed, we're entertained, we're moved, we laugh, we cry, we walk away with lower levels of anxiety, and so on I may go. And my point is this: when you assess what your goal is going to be for your next business pitch, challenge yourself to really identify what will be your marker of success. Will it be that more people know your name? Will it be that more people understand what your value propositions are? Or will you go to the top? Will you look for investors? Will you look for partners? Will you look for mentors? But by establishing that goal in advance, for many of our young entrepreneurs, it can really help them to make sure that they're constantly level setting every room they walk into and every pitch opportunity they've been given. Okay, so let's come to a little bit of a level set of our own here for a second, folks. And I'm going to ask you about the last time that you pitched, about the last time that you got in front of somebody, in front of a room, in front of an audience, and you were given their time. And you began to think, how do they process my pitch? How did they process my presentation? How did it go, right? Were they with me? And one of the things that we know from the persuasive literature is that generally speaking, most people are going to process information in one of two primary ways. So very quickly, here's my why. Here's my theory. Okay, you don't need to remember the name of it. You don't need to remember any of the terms, but I want you to take away this basic premise. In the elaboration likelihood model, what's known as a dual process model, it simply suggests that we as human beings, we process incoming information through one of two channels. And the channel in which we select is dictated primarily by one factor. And that factor is your overall involvement in the message. And let me give you some other synonyms for involvement. How much do you care about it? How much time have you spent with it? How many resources have you invested in it? How knowledgeable are you on the topic? How close to your heart or to your cognitions is this topic? If it's very high and it's something that you're really passionate and you know a lot about, you're processing via the central route. Okay. When you process via the central route, what happens? You begin to really dissect that message, right? So I want you to pick a topic right now that you know a lot about, right? Where you're from, the topics that you teach, your very small business niche, right? Places that you've been. And if I were to start presenting those topics, immediately what would happen is your brain would start to go, I agree with that. I disagree with that. I don't know if that's right, Rory. I'm not quite sure. And you'd be critiquing that message with great detail and great scrutiny. And any time that an audience is scrutinizing your message, I need you to immediately recognize they're processing centrally. This is a good thing, because here's what we know. When you're processing centrally, you're more likely to retain the information, and you're more likely to potentially down the road make a behavioral shift that will last a long time. In other words, think about some of the most important decisions that you've ever made in your life: buying a home, buying a car, large investments. You thought about them and you scrutinized them. Most of you did, right? And eventually when you came to that conclusion, you said, I'm in, because you'd gone through all the thought processing. Now, wouldn't it be lovely if just for a moment you lived in a world where everybody cared as much about your things, right, as you do? How many times when you've actually pitched to an audience have they shared that same level of passion and enthusiasm and knowledge and know-how and experience on the topic you're pitching? And let's cut to the chase here for a second, Jen, because we've sat through a lot of these. We've sat through molecular catalysts, right? We've sat through swimsuits and baseball bats and everything in between. And sometimes we know a little bit, and sometimes we know a lot, and sometimes we know nothing. But here's the deal. About 99% of the audiences that you will meet and go through this world, they don't know and likely probably don't care a whole heck of a lot about the thing that you're so passionate about. In other words, they're processing via the peripheral route. So you're probably thinking, all right, Roy, cut to the chase. Most of my audience is processing via the peripheral route. Tell me what I need to know. So here's what you need to know. When we process via the peripheral route, we care much more about many of the heuristics, the aesthetics of the message and the message sender themselves. In other words, because we have relatively low levels of involvement or knowledge or know-how in the topic, we must rely on these other factors. And I'll give you a very succinct story and example. Back when I was a young man, 22 years of age, I hurt my knee and I went into my doctor out in Farmington, a Yukon man, of course. And I said, Doc, my knee hurts. We'll send you for an MRI. We got the MRI, went into his office, and he calls the MRI up on his machine and he buzzes around this picture for a good 2 or 3 minutes. It's clouds and it's dark smoke. And he says, right there, you're missing a piece of cartilage. We're gonna have to go in and do surgery on it. Now, me being, a little bit naive and probably even quite ignorant at that time in my age, I said, I need the disc. Give me the disc. I'm gonna take it home. I'll look at this myself, right? So I go home, I take the disc home with me and I download an MRI reading program. And what happens, right? I look at the MRI and I realize, I don't know what I'm looking at. I have no idea. I have no know-how in terms of how to read an MRI. And therefore, what I must do in this moment is simply rely on one thing. I must rely on the credibility of my doctor and what it was that he told to me, because I didn't have the ability to assess it myself. So very counterintuitively for some of you today, I'm going to let you know that when your audiences are processing you peripherally, and for the most part, I'm going to tell you that they're looking at your credibility probably before you walk in the room or the virtual room. They've Googled you, they've looked you up, they've been on your LinkedIn profile. And what I want to remind you before we even get into the storytelling piece is that you as a storyteller must be able to assess how they will perceive your credibility. You see, now I ended up going under the knife with my good friend, Dr. Arciero, because I trusted him. He, in my eyes, had credibility, but he may not have credibility in your eyes. He may not have credibility to others. And we could go down this list of people that have credibility to us and those that do not. But my point is this, is that when you step forth in front of a room to pitch, if they are processing peripherally, they are leaning heavily on your credibility in that given moment before you've even opened your mouth. So as a bit of a segue and sidebar here, you might be wondering, okay, Roy, was there anything I can do to move my credibility before you tell me how to tell a story? Sure. Number one, adapt your style to your audience. Number two, create empathy. We're similar in a lot of ways. You and I, we share a lot of things in common. And most importantly is the last one, number four, have a credible source introduce or endorse you. Let's talk about this, entrepreneurs. We keep talking about our network and we talk about our mentors and how important it is to have the right people. Yes, and it's important for them to dispel their information and knowledge upon you, but it becomes incredibly important when they introduce you to their network because you are relying on their credibility. So entrepreneurs, when you go forth to pitch, it is critical, right, that when you are introduced and when you are presented and when you are put forth, find somebody that has credibility with that audience and have them be the person that endorses you, because with their endorsement, you will, for a short amount of time, have their credibility theoretically bestowed upon you. Okay, we spent 16 minutes in the first half building simply a foundation, but I know you came for story, so let's get there. And we can get there now understanding what we need to do before we actually sit down and put pen to paper to write these great stories. So the art and the science of story in business. Well, let's check this out for a second. Storytelling is far and away the oldest known form of sharing a narrative. It's how we build culture and tradition. And for many of you, it is literally how you know about where you came from. It wasn't through a book or an encyclopedia or any Wikipedia page that you understood your culture and your traditions and who you were. So one of the things that I tend to find about story is that it's pretty impactful, but I won't just give you my word for it. Let's insert some of your answers here. So for just a moment, I'd love to work through these. And if anybody wants to come off mute and answer the question, or would love to give us a little bit of a chat, that'd be fantastic. But let's answer these three questions rather succinctly together as a group. And the first question that I have here is, what's the impact of a great story? Jen, what's the impact of a great story on you?
The way it makes me feel.
Love it. The way it makes you feel, right? Awesome. Yolanda, I see your face and I see you smiling. I want to talk to you, right? So Yolanda, tell me a little bit about, what do you think are some elements of a great story? What are some of those pieces?
Passion, understanding, joy. I don't know.
Yeah, those are all great answers. And more importantly than anything, they're great answers because they're your answers. And what's important is what story means to you. So Michaela, let me ask you the last question. What are the characteristics of a great storyteller?
To make rapport with the people that are listening.
All right, very good. We'll take that. So let's just say I polled everybody and I pulled their answers together and then I refined them and curated them. They probably look a little bit something like this, right? So here's why I'm telling you that you need to bring story into your business. But you know what? For the sake of your friends and your partners and the people you live with, tell better stories for them too. We're getting there. But check this out. This is why story matters. I've gone through and looked at the last 20 years of literature around communication and entrepreneurship, and nobody's talking about this. We're looking at 25-page business plans and pitches, but they do nothing to make sure that what you are presenting is compelling, that it is memorable, and that in many ways it becomes brief, succinct. So one of the things that I like about story and what I'm going to convince you today is that it can be actually rather formulaic. So some of those great role models of storytellers that you were thinking about when I kicked things off a little bit earlier, they're following a formula. Chances are maybe some of them didn't even realize that they were following a formula, but you're going to learn their formula today and you're going to be able to put it to action in just a little bit. So story is critical for these reasons. It can be relatable, right? As Michaela said, with the rapport. It can be memorable. One of my favorite parts about a story, when I watch a great TV show or a movie or I read a great book, what do, Jen? We share it. We go, you got to hear this story. Think back about your last years in COVID, right? And how many texts or messages or calls were sent to be like, did you see this thing? Did you read this thing? There's literally a short share button on every social media platform, right? Because it's an amazing story and I want to share it with you. Tell amazing business pitches. Because just because your audience isn't going to invest in it doesn't mean they're not going to walk down the hall and tell somebody else about, hey, you got to find out about this thing. If you don't have a great story that they can repeat, that they understand, they're probably not going to share it. And that could be just as costly as them not investing. So check this out, stories everywhere. Here's some of your favorite TV shows. And many of you, if I asked you, you could give me a succinct summary of what the show is about. Now, why did I pick these shows? You might notice a commonality. They're all about organizations. And some of these are about rather innocuous, you might even say mundane organizations. And yet these are hit TV shows, right? They were able to tell compelling, long-lasting, multi-series TV shows about The Office, selling paper. That's compelling. Yes, if written correctly. Let's go one step further. You've heard of Disney, right? Maybe in some ways the best virtual and video storytellers of our time, right? Disney has a very formulaic approach. Take The Little Mermaid for a second, right? In an ordinary world, there was a mermaid who would hang out with her friends, Sebastian, and they would swim around and life was good until one day she laid eyes on this human being and fell in love. And after falling in love, she recognized she had to put a plan together to see and to be with this person. And of course, you know the rest, right? But look through all these stories, right? There's a story arc and there's a formula to it. Why is it not in your business pitch? Is Disney wrong? No, I don't think so. They've been getting it right for a long time and they probably will. So what can we learn? So let's make it really simple. In a world where there's an ordinary reality, for you and your business right now, the ordinary reality is the world that we're living in right now. Entrepreneurs that are on this line, what's the ordinary world that we're living in? What is this just totally fine world that we're living in? And then what happened? What was your aha moment? What was your light bulb? The innovation, the breakthrough where you said, wait a minute, the world could be better if this thing existed. There's your story. Check this out. One of my favorite story arcs of all time to really kind of make this point. And I'm going to throw it back, which means you're going to need to have been born in like 1980 to have any clue what I'm talking about. But here's a movie called Speed. Keanu Reeves, Dennis Hopper, Sandra Bullock. Very simple premise in the story here, right? In an ordinary world, people needed to get places, so they took buses. One day, a mad bomber hijacks this bus with a bomb. And there's a set of clauses, but the most important clause, if you've seen the movie Speed, is that the bus can't go under 50 miles an hour or the bomb will go off. So our flawed protagonists, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, step in to save the day. But the stakes are raised because they can't figure out how to defuse the bomb. And I won't ruin the movie for you in case I've got your attention. But this story, built on such a basic premise, was one of the best suspense films in the 1990s because the story was so simple. The bus goes under 50, the story ends. The bus stays over 50, everybody lives. But how do you keep the bus going? It's going to run out of fuel. It's going to run out of space. There's nowhere to land it. Your business plans and pitches would be a lot more compelling if they were written and looked like the Speed film that I'm referencing here. So check this out. For those of you that like to read, I've written it down for you. In an ordinary world, you or your customer is a flawed protagonist. And you learn something, you discover something, you're frustrated by something. And then you, the entrepreneur, figures out, how am I going to solve this problem? And you come up with a solution. But the stakes are raised. Okay, entrepreneurs, listen to me right now. This is by far the most important, compelling part of your business pitch. Let's say you have a 5-minute business pitch, okay? Somewhere at minute 3, I need you to raise the stakes for me. So you've introduced a compelling reason why this is important. You've told me your value propositions and how you're going to solve the problem. The world's going to be so great and rosy, but there's a problem. There's a problem. I don't have enough money. I don't have the time. I don't have the resource. I don't have the partnership. I don't have the audience. I don't have the access. I don't have the software. Whatever it is, the stakes are raised. And see, here's the problem, you see, because when these stakes are raised, if I don't get those things, if we don't bring this innovation to the world, what's going to happen, right? So I need you to pitch in a way that says, without this innovation, we're potentially looking at a catastrophe, right? And if you can't convince me or compel me in that moment that without the world in which your innovation exists, it's not better, it's the same. I'm not making lateral moves. I'm not investing in things that are going to make my world the same. I'm going to invest in things that are going to make my world better, different, unique, and fulfill some challenge that I have. So you have to introduce the stakes. Now, all of this sounds good. And for those of you who are visual learners, check this out, right? There's an incident, there's a problem that takes place in ordinary reality. The stakes are raised. And this is your new utopian world in which your innovation is suddenly present. All right, let's cut to the chase. We got about 5 minutes left and you were looking for some tidbits that you could take with you. So let's do this, right? This is a great way to think about writing your pitch, or as I call it, your screenplay. Now, remember folks, you don't have to do this in front of rooms. You could do this through an Instagram story. right? You can do this in your Reddit and your blog. You can actually write this out and deliver it as a very compelling piece on LinkedIn. You can get in front of audiences and you can deliver it in this way too. But what I'm going to ask you to work through right here very quickly is kind of understanding who are the main characters of your story, right? Who are your customers? Who are your clients? What's this world that they live in? Now, I want to invite you to remember that your audience can be very, very niche. In fact, the story will be better if you focus on a very narrow segment and audience of people. Who is most afflicted by this problem in this world that they live in that has this issue? What did you discover? What did you find in your laboratory, in your mind? What did you invent? What did you make? What did you create? And what problem literally will it solve? Then there's the pressure mounting. There's this barrier. There's this thing that's holding you back. You don't have something. And because you don't have it, you need it. And that's why you're talking to these people, because you think they're going to help you get the thing that you need so that we can bring this solution to these people that have this problem. And then finally, you know, one of the things that great storytellers do is they always bring it back to like right now, 11/26, Thursday, March 31st. All of us sitting here will never get this moment back again. So those of you sitting here in this room, my compelling call to you is to change the way in which you pitch, to use story and to not be afraid of it. Yeah, you, Michaela and Jen and Alicia and Yolanda and Megan and everybody that's here. You see, what I did was I brought you back into this exact moment, because if I tell my story in history, it's fine. But one of the great things that historians do is they always bring the history back to today, right? And they make it relevant to what's going on in the world today. So don't just tell me a story about your problem in your world that I can't relate to. It's got to be relatable to me. Now I've got 3 minutes left and I'm going to try to prove a point. All of this is great, but the world that we live in has a 6-second attention span. And you've heard about elevator pitches. Let's talk about an escalator pitch. I'm going to shorten you down. You're not going to get 60 seconds. I'm going to give you 3 sentences in a moment here, right? This is our good friend, Mark Twain, and he's been credited with this quote that I quite love, and I use it quite often. Not that the story need be long, but it will take a long while to make it short. So here's the deal. I'm calling you and all of your friends out on this. You want to be an effective storyteller? You're not going to have an infinite amount of space or time. I know some of you are moaning and groaning at the length of feature films these days. 2.5 hours, 3 hours, 3.5 hours? What do you want me to do with this, right? Wrap it up, get to the point. Mark Twain told us this almost 100 years ago. So let's put it into action. I'm going to give you 3 words and 3 sentences to set up your business pitch. So check this out. But therefore, you've been using these words all along. Let's string them together and make our stories much more interesting. Now, real quickly, I've got to give credit to Randy Olson, who put all these ideas together, and I'm extracting some of these concepts from his book, Houston, We Have a Narrative. If you like reading or listening to books, it's one of my favorites. It's probably been one of the most influential pieces in my life over the last 10 years for how I go about teaching communication. If you're on the left-hand side, you're pretty boring. And we know these people. And you've got some folks that are on the right-hand side. We work at an institution of higher education, and sometimes many of our great philosophers and researchers, we tend to be a little despite, however, yet and lofty, without ever actually telling a story that's compelling. And then right in the middle, you have your Goldilocks sweet spot, right? ABT. So let's put it into action and let's go ahead and use this, right? So the and describes the ordinary world. It describes the situation, but gives us the problem, the complication, and therefore is what you're doing, entrepreneurs, to bring some solution and to change the world that we live in to make it ultimately a better place. So I've come up with a little formula that you can all put into action today, and it is ABT, a business thought. So check this out. Right? Let's just kind of work through this. 3 sentences. I'm going to give you 3 sentences to pitch me from now on, right? Not an elevator speech, not 60 seconds, right? Not 5 minutes, 3 sentences. So individuals have always needed something, right? Individuals need things, right? What is the thing that they need, and how have they been fulfilling that need forever and ever and ever? That's the ordinary reality. But you've discovered something, you've innovated something, you made something, and upon that discovery, you started going, you know, this could really change the way that we used to do that thing back in the day. Therefore, I am now doing something to make that old thing, that old way better as a result of this discovery and innovation. I love this method and I love this story because what it does is it invites folks into your conversation. I get to go back and to ask you about your premise. Is that really the way that people did things? Yes, it is. I've done a tremendous amount of research and they've been doing it this way for an awful long time. Tell me a little bit more about your innovation. Does it really work? How do you know? Have you tested it? Oh, you're doing this thing now. How are you doing it? I always used to hear that when you go on an interview, right, and you're having a conversation with somebody that's interviewing you, the more that they talk is oftentimes a great indicator that they're enjoying the conversation with you. So when you go to pitch, tell a story, have a conversation. And I'll leave you with these final 4 thoughts. You want to be a better storyteller? You, the individual storyteller that's on this call this morning, tell it from the heart, be genuine, right? Have humility. Take all of the feedback that you get from your audience and your stories and say, thank you. We're not always going to like the feedback. We're not even going to agree with the feedback, but the feedback that you're getting from one individual is likely in some ways representative of others out there in the world that you will encounter. Take their feedback. You don't necessarily have to change what you're doing, but you do have to appreciate the time and effort that somebody likely gave you. Be honest. Attract people to your business that you want to do work with. In other words, don't make things up. Don't manipulate yourself or your business plan or your story to fit their needs, because when they come on board, you're only going to discover that they weren't right for you. You don't need to convince every member of your audience to invest in you. You don't have to win over every VC. You need the right one. And if you are not being authentic to what your story is, you're going to attract the wrong investors, and that will pay consequences later on down the road. And lastly, if you want to be funny, tell the truth. One of the things that we know, for those of you who have ever done any joke writing in your life, is that the funniest things in life are the things that are real and true and happen to you. So be honest, and you will be likely a whole lot more likable in the end. We're out of time. This has been a ton of fun. I hope you enjoyed it and appreciated it and got something out of it. Michaela is going to throw her email in the chat. If you're interested in learning more about how to bring storytelling and narrative into your business pitches, by all means, send Michaela a message and say, hey, I'm interested in this. We'd love to potentially consider some workshops down the road and seeing where our levels of interested. My name is Rory McGloin, and for those of you I'm not friends with or don't know yet, feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn and connect. And at this point, I'll stop sharing and I'll kick it over to Michaela for her closing thoughts.
Wow, thank you so much for that phenomenal presentation, Rory. That was great. We appreciate the time you took to talk with all of us today. And before we wrap up, we do have 2 upcoming timely topics that will be on April 6th with Nova Lorraine talking about burnout and creativity. And then also on April 14th, we will have Rach Brand, who will be discussing commercializing big ideas and how to push yourself to think bigger. So thank you again. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you.
Michaela, you can turn off the recording.